Hello, this is Georgina Rose, part-time esoteric content creator and part-time wickedest woman on YouTube. And welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss a variety of subjects. We discuss mysticism, religion, esoterica, philosophy, and culture, and everything on the fringes of esoterica as well. And in this video, I am continuing with my flagship series on the channel that I've been doing for over 2 years now, the Occult 101 series. What this is a series where I introduce concepts, paradigms, and topics that fall under the occult umbrella in a digestible, beginner-friendly way so that you can watch this video and then jump off into further research. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about Jinn. Jinn are something that I've not talked about, and I don't find occultists tend to discuss at all, let alone like actually work with in a spiritual sense. I find that most discussion about the Jinn tends to be pushed and discussed by people who are Islamic commentators. The thing is, Jinn actually predate Islam and are a rich part of pre-Islamic Arab folklore. But of course, they are central to Islamic belief as well. So before I get into all that, what is a Jinn? So if you're from the West like me, you're probably familiar with the term genie, or you've seen Aladdin and seen the genie character. So genie are Jinn, and it's sort of been, written G-E-N-E-I because that sort of makes more sense to us, whereas Jinn is written D-J-I-N-N or J-I-N-N. So, yeah. So what are they? So Jinn are actually really interesting, and they're a lot more than spirits that come and grant you wishes. In fact, there are many classes of Jinn. Just like in Western Christian lore, there are whole, kingdoms, princes, and hierarchies of demons and angels. Jinn are the same way. There are actually multiple major classes of Jinn, and the different types of Jinn interact with you differently. The interesting thing about Jinn is that not all Jinn are the same. So often we tend to categorize spirits in this very black and white way, right? They're either good spirits or they're bad spirits. Jinn can be both. In fact, Jinn, there's a lot of variance amongst them. Jinn actually have lives like humans. They can get married, they can have sex, they can have kids, they eat, they drink. They live like us, and they can be all shades of good versus evil. So as well, Jinn actually have religions. There are Muslim Jinn, there are pagan Jinn, there are Christian Jinn, there are Jewish Jinn, just like us. They have whole lives and they all have different views, meaning that each Jinn is actually really different. And the way that they interact with actually really vary. Jinn are generally described as spirits of smokeless fire, but they can appear and shapeshift in many ways. There are different beliefs on where Jinn come from. With specific types of Jinn, particularly the Korean, which I will come back to later, it is viewed that they are sort of kind of semi-human, but on other dimensions, whereas some believe they are sort of bound to this plane. I guess the closest thing in the West would be the Saladin, which if you're familiar with Western mysticism, you will know that the Saladin is our term for fire spirits, but I think there's still a variance because Saladin are specifically elemental spirits that correspond to the element of fire, whereas Jinn are a little more complex than that, right? There's a lot of variation amongst Jinn. What's really interesting is if a Jinn is wholly evil, they can turn into a shaitan. Shaitan sounds like Satan, so our Western brains are like Satan, 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 and shaitan essentially means evil spirit or devil. There are multiple shaitans. There's sort of this idea that like within Islam in particular, the devil of Islam is called shaitan, which is kind of true, but the term would be Iblis. There are different beliefs on the Islamic Satan. Some believe that he is his own spirit, but many believe that he is like a really powerful shaitan jinn. So that's another gap between the sort of Islamic spirituality and the other Abrahamic spiritualities that we're familiar with. And Jinn were everywhere in pre-Islamic pagan stuff. They are all over the place. They appear constantly in Arabian storytelling and folklore and poetry. If you've ever heard of the 1001 Nights, you will be very familiar with Jinn because Jinn appear in them heavily. The idea of putting a Jinn in a bottle is an interesting idea, and I want to explore where that comes from. So according to Arabian belief, King Solomon, the King Solomon that we associate with the grimoires here in the West, actually was able to capture Jinn and put them in containers. And so there's a variety of mystic techniques that actually relate to trapping Jinn. Much like any other spirit traps, you can trap them, right? You lock them in there and then you can remove them and release them. Now, not all Jinn are going to grant you wishes. That's a bit of a cultural idea that we've picked up, but that's not really what they do. They're used in a variety of ways. One particular type of jinn that I find particularly fascinating is the Qareen. So the Qareen is spoken about heavily in Islam, and it is believed that every human has a Qareen. And this belief does appear to predate Islam, because if you look at other Abrahamic traditions, the idea of like a holy guardian angel appears, but not in this way. It's a very different understanding of a guardian spirit than what you see in, say, Christianity. Because the Qareen is actually bound to you and with you at all times. No matter where you are, the Qareen is connected to you. And through specific rituals and conjurations, you can speak with your Qareen. But you don't really need to do that, because it's believed that, you know, when you get those intrusive thoughts in the back of your mind and they sort of enter in and start kind of speaking to you, that is your Qareen speaking to you. And it is believed that based on how virtuous you are, your Qareen is either good or evil. And it was believed that if you are righteous enough, you can make your Qareen holy, a believer, wholly good. And Muhammad actually claims that he was able to convert his Qareen to Islam, which you don't see that with any other Abrahamic like guardian angel lore. Actually, I think that it's more similar to the daemon idea, which if you guys don't know, in ancient Greece, it was believed, particularly if you're familiar with the lore around Socrates, that everyone had a daemon, which is sort of a guiding intelligence that can give them advice and teach them things. It's more like that. Honestly, I think another good comparison is how the holy guardian angel is discussed in Western occultism. If you're familiar with Western occultism, the HGA is something that's heavily emphasized, particularly in traditions like modern Hermeticism and Thelema. It is believed that there is a spirit called the Holy Guardian Angel that through intense ritual, work, devotion, and practice you can commune with and develop this thing called knowledge and conversation. And then once you develop this knowledge and conversation, your Holy Guardian Angel guides you and gives you sort of instructions on your spiritual path, your life path, and is with you for the rest of your spiritual journey. And it's more like that. I think that's a better parallel, because when people analyze the Holy Guardian Angel in the West, there's a lot of debate about how that spirit functions, right? Many believe that the Holy Guardian Angel is actually linked to you, and that through specific astrological calculations, you can figure out who your HGA is and commune with them. This reminds you of the Qareen, because like the HGA, the Qareen is always bound to you. It's connected to you. And so it does kind of raise that same theological question that we see in the West. Is the Qareen the same as you? Is it linked to you? Is it part of you, or is it an external entity? Arabia has a particular answer about the Qareen. It is believed that the Qareen is actually you on another dimension. It is a parallel you, a shadow you. And so what your Qareen says actually directly reflects on you. Once again, if you become righteous, your Qareen becomes holy. If you become a bad person, your Qareen can actually turn completely into a shaitan and be entirely evil and give you advice that completely guides you into the depths of the abyss where Karanzan will eat you. I added that Karanzan bit. That's not in the folklore, but it's pretty similar. Whereas the HGA doesn't do that. As well, to contact the Qareen is actually pretty simple, right? If you look at Jinn Sorcery by Al-Alim, which is one of the few books in the West on Jinn, it actually has multiple conjurations for the Qareen, and they're really simple. It's a lot of repeating the same thing and saying various things, and then the Qareen will talk to you. Interestingly, when people report on communicating with a Qareen, it is typically described as hearing a voice talking to you from behind. So, interestingly, you can contact it immediately, but it's a spoken voice, which is interesting because Jinn are often described as smokeless fire. So you don't typically see that fire, but I think that's a cool little tidbit. As well, it is believed that Jinn hang around unclean areas, particularly bathrooms. My favorite little bit of folklore from the Arabian world is that Jinn live in the toilets and lurk in the toilets. So if you ever are having a nasty time on the toilet, the Jinn are getting you, the Jinn are coming for you, and that if you are in unclean places, it's easier to contact and connect to Jinn. So, by this logic, you should be doing all your esoteric rituals in the bathroom if you want to commune with the Jinn. As well, there is sort of a notion that I've noticed amongst occultists that Jinn are particularly scary, that they are somehow like really different, terrifying things. I don't really buy into that because once again, there are many types of Jinn. There is not one type of Jinn. In fact, Jinn can be holy if they are sort of thinking the right way. I really think Jinn are kind of a thing on their own. If you compare them to Western demons, I actually think Jinn are probably a little bit nicer. But Jinn can possess you. Much like in the West, there's a lot of belief about Jinn possession. In the Arabian world, Jinn possession is used to describe a lot of ailments, right? People who are really sick, people who are mentally ill, are often believed to be victims of Djinn possession. Furthermore, it seems to be a lot more common for Djinn possession to happen than demonic possession. Obviously, the Djinn that possess people are in the sort of evil class of Djinn. If you look at the Middle Eastern world, there are many accounts of people who claim they are possessed by Djinn. As well, much like in the West has exorcisms, there are ways to remove the Djinn from the body. These are typically called evictions, though there are a number of terms for them. And the way that this is done is by saying specific names, chanting things, reading specific passages that have spiritual value, and removing. As well, there is one particular method known as a ruqya, which is also used to undo a lot of curses, hexes, and evil energy that has interesting stuff with water in it. If you look at one of the ruqyas that is available online, because some of them are available online, there's an interesting tidbit in it where you fill up a glass with water, and you say verses to the water, you say things to the water, and then you spit in the water, and you pour the water on yourself, and you sort of get the water all over you, and it clears it out. As well, there are quite a few where people create talismans on paper, where you will write specific names, specific things, and then there's one really interesting one I read that you're supposed to do on a Friday. You're supposed to do different evictions depending on the day of the week or time of the year. And you write out this talisman, you create this talisman, you write all these letters everywhere, you do the whole thing. And then you put it under your foot and you stand on it and you say a specific chant while standing on it, and it is supposed to lead to an eviction. Like all ideas on possession, it is believed that there are many different levels of possession and levels of intensity related to the possession. They are not all the same. This is a common idea all over the place, right? That there are different levels of possession, and possession can lead to a variety of ailments and problems. Now I'm gonna get into the real heresy territory, which always fun heresy territory. I love being in heresy territory. And since I'm going there, I'm sure I will get some really fun comments. But I'm gonna do it anyways because I do what I want. So, using Jinn for spiritual reasons is a thing that people do. It is controversial, and in Islam, it is definitely a no-no. But I'm not a Muslim. I'm a pagan, so I do what I want. Become ungovernable. Become ungovernable, right? Become spiritually ungovernable. Anyways, it is believed that you can use the Jinn to do a lot of things, and people have for a long time. If you look at the pre-Islamic era pagan world, though sadly we don't have a lot on it very tragically, there was a heavy integration of magic into culture, as there is in most of the world until the modern period. And the Jinn can do all sorts of magical favors for you. There are a lot of talismans that contain Jinn references. There's a lot of Jinn conjurations, and you can use Jinn for all sorts of things. There are accounts of people using Jinn to curse people, to heal people, to get money, to get women, all the things you see people doing magic for, and these are typically done talismanically and through conjurations. So in the West, we've used these terms invocation and evocation a lot. When you're talking about the Jinn, it is much more of an evocation, but Jinn evocation is actually structured a little differently. If you look at the conjurations themselves, it's very different. It's kind of a different flavor of esotericism entirely. Like it's a whole new framework, right? And they're framed in really interesting ways because you don't make the circles, you don't do the triangle of art. It's mostly verbal. A large percentage of the stuff from Arabian mysticism, pre-Islamic, post-Islamic, all of it, is that it's a lot of just chanting and talking, and there's a heavy emphasis on fasting and ritual purification prior to. As well, intention is incredibly important when talking about any of these traditions. In the West, we talk a lot about intention isn't everything, and it's a belief that I completely believe in. If you just intend for something to happen, it's not necessarily going to happen. Things are more complicated than that. But when we are looking at Jinn stuff, intention is really, really important. Any sort of Arabian magical practice, going in with an intention makes or breaks a ritual and makes or breaks what you're doing. It's incredibly important to have an intention going in. So when you do these conjurations, you need that intention there and you need to be laser focused on it. And then you're going to be doing a lot of chanting and repetition. There's interesting stuff where there's like specific ways that it tends to be phrased that you'll see repeatedly. It's a lot of repetition, like hundreds of repeating phrases. Like you say your phrase like hundreds and hundreds of times. One Korean conjuration, you say it over 1,000 times. It's a lot of repetition and they take a while. But by this repetition, you get the thing. Also, offerings are not as emphasized, though I would still advise doing it. It's a different flavor of things. It's a lot less like material heavy, but a lot more time intensive and exhaustive. If you look at Western magic on the whole, generally you're spending a lot of time, particularly if you're talking about ceremonial stuff, on preparing the space and all that. This stuff, it's a lot less like that, right? It's a lot of, you need prayer beads to count what you're doing, and you need to create these talismans. Typically, you create these talismans on your hands or on paper. So it's actually really easy. There's a lot of emphasis on writing on the hands. Like you'll write all sorts of stuff all over your hand. And if you look at drawings like related to this stuff, you'll see a lot of hands drawn. Put it on your hand, put it on paper, and then use it. As well, there's a lot of dream work related to Jinn. So dream divination is something that exists everywhere, and Jung really solidified in our modern psyche the importance of dreams and what dreams mean. Dreams can give us a lot of incredibly valuable and useful information, and dream divination is really a big part of Jinn stuff. There's a lot of times where you will create a talisman, you will say things before bed, typically with some conditions, and then the Jinn will communicate with you through your dreams. Because once again, there's a belief that some of these Jinn exist on higher planes or lower planes. So dream work is great. You can do all sorts of dream divination with this stuff. In the Arab pagan world, there was this really interesting stuff where people would throw arrows to divine, but that was not the only divination method. This dream stuff was a thing. So that's really cool. And so you can just commune through dreams, which for a lot of people seems a lot more mild than doing full-on, like, you know, attempting to conjure something. So dream stuff, totally an option. But whatever you do an eviction. Do an eviction. When we're talking about any of this stuff, you need to learn how to get rid of things before you bring them in, right? Otherwise, there's like a real unbalance and problems arise. So be careful. I think that they are really interesting spirits. Just know the difference between all of them and do your research. I remember when I got a copy of Jinn Sorcery by Al-Alim, it was the first occult book I had ever gotten that actually had a warning in the front, which was really interesting because I just was not used to seeing that. I mean, no books have that. So do your due diligence, be careful, but I think it's a lot more accessible than people think it is. I think some of this stuff looks really intimidating because obviously there's a lot of different instructions. It's a different thing, right? When you approach this stuff, it looks really different, it seems really different, but there's still a lot of value there. And the final note that I wanted to leave this video with is that Jinn existed in the pre-Islamic pagan world. And so if you're going to explore pre-Islamic Arab paganism, which I had discussed previously, which sadly is so under-discussed, it shocks me how little people talk about it. Probably because it is kind of a controversial topic. I mean, people have really strong opinions on it. There's a lot of like misinformation about how the pre-Islamic Arab pagans were like horrible, and if Islam hadn't have happened, the Arabian world would be miserable. I think that's like kind of nonsense. I think that any religion, when they go on a conversion campaign, is obviously going to, you know, say stuff about the religion before it that are just a little exacerbated, but it did exist in that world too. Jinn folklore is distinct. It's very different from what you see in the other Abrahamic faiths. It's kind of its own thing. And there's a lot of, like every religion, any religion that follows it is going to take emphasis from what came from it, right? And Islam has a lot of pagan elements thrown in there. Of course, Islam does claim to be the most pure monotheism ever, but that's just not how religions evolve, right? Everything takes influence from what came before. And I think with Jinn, we should give credit to the pre-Islamic Arab pagans for a lot of this stuff seemingly coming from that. A lot of these magical traditions, they're so different from what you see in Jewish mysticism and Christian mysticism that I have to think there is some sort of pagan origin to them, particularly because it is documented that the pre-Islamic Arab pagans did believe in the Jinn and that the Jinn do predate the rise of Islam and the Arabian conversion. So I thought that'd be interesting to just kind of leave you with some food for thought. And that's most of what I want to say. There's a variety of writing on Jinn. Some of it, sadly, is not translated to English. I really wish I could get more information that was translated to English, but sadly, it just isn't there. But there's a lot to look at. I'll put some books in the description that I found useful when making this video. And yeah, I guess that's what I'm going to leave you with. If you want to see more of me, I make videos on this channel. As well, I do a podcast called The Postmodern Iconoclast, which is a more commentary podcast. I have a lot of different guests come on and we talk about all sorts of interesting subjects. You can listen to that on this channel or on all podcasting platforms. I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Telegram, Odyssey, Substack. I'm everywhere. There's really no platform I'm not on. But if you want to keep this going, which would mean the world to me, you should check out my Patreon. My Patreon is great and it has a lot of stuff. Particularly this month, since it is Samhain, which is a really awesome European pagan festival, I have a Samhain-themed ritual guide. I've put a lot of work into it, and it has Samhain rituals and traditions that you can follow along with at home. As well, I give these videos all early. I give extra videos once a month, which are typically more advanced. I do my ritual guides every month. And if you are a high enough tier, I will do personal spiritual consultations with you where I can answer your questions or give you advice or whatever you want to use that time for. So yeah, also if you don't want to do Patreon, there's one last thing. You can donate on Venmo at @darling or through my Ko-Fi link below. Thank you for your continued support. Like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell, and you will never need to know what a Jinn is again. All right, bye, and see you in the next one.